together. So I wanted to start this presentation by telling you about the oldest mathematical artifact in the world. So this is a baboon fibula. So it's the leg bone of a baboon, and it has had 29 notches cut in it. So it is believed to be up to 43,000 years old. So other bones like this have been found, which are up to 80,000 years old. But this is the first one that they could definitely say was used as a mathematical calendar. So it's called the Lebombo bone. And so it's from the Lebombo Mountains, which are in Eswatini, which is what used to be called Swaziland. So it's from southern Africa. And so it is said that this may have been used as a lunar phase counter. And therefore, these African women may have been the first mathematicians in the world. So what's interesting, what I found really interesting, was that they're still using these type of calendars today. So there's people in Namibia who are still making bone tallies to count and to date and to time things. So it's like this is something that has always happened, and they're still doing it even now. So that's really exciting. So this is one artifact, but it's the oldest artifact, way back, you know, really the very early kind of humans. So this is Alexander Marshak. So Marshak was a scientist. He was actually someone who was doing work for NASA. So he was calculating, he'd been asked to compile a kind of historical record of the moon landings. So this is another thing, you can read Marshak's biography. I've listed it in the additional resources in the unit. But yeah, so he's really interesting. So he was asked to kind of make this record of the work of NASA. And then somehow this work with looking at the moon, he ended up making these discoveries that relate to really ancient Paleolithic archaeological findings. So he's kind of had like a job change where he started looking at these ancient artifacts and realizing that they were mathematical systems, calculators. So Marshak was really the first theorist to talk about these bones, these engravings. So the bone, which is really well known that Marshak writes about, is called the Ishango bone. And so you can see on this bone that it has tally marks for groups of days over the course of a lunar calendar. So this is two different pictures of the sides of the bone. And then up here is the Lebombo bone. So, you know, there's more than 20,000 years between these two different lunar calendars, but they're essentially the same. They're engravings, they're tally marks, which are counting dates on bones. So this is Marshak's paper. So this was published in Science, and I've put a link to this on the additional resources. So you can read, the first page of it is open source, but if anybody's got academic access, maybe you can get the whole of the paper. If you can send it to us. I haven't asked any of my friends who are in academia to get it for me, but I can. If any of you want to read the paper in full, let me know if you want a full text. But this was his original publication, which was in 1964. And he was looking particularly at findings within the French, the Magdalenian culture. So these were the people that were making this very early cave art in France near the Pyrenees. I don't know if any of you have been to see it, but they're quite amazing caves. So yeah, but what he found was that these markings were universally represented in Paleolithic culture. So there were lots of other people in other countries that were also marking their lunar calendars at this kind of stage in human development. So here's another example of a lunar calendar. So this is from one of the French cave findings. And you can actually see here, I think this one's great because like these ones, okay, yeah, these are counting days and they're tally marks, right? But these ones, you can actually see people have drawn the moon, you know, and they've drawn the moon in its different phases, in its different shapes, and the amount of light that's kind of emerging from it in the sky. So I think that's quite incredible. So I have found some particularly juicy bits of Marshak's work. So yeah, Marshak theorized that this evidence of these tallies on bones should necessitate a complete re-evaluation of human culture. So Marshak, he asserted that the calculations of menstruation, the ability to be able to link the lived experience of the changing menstrual cycle with the lunar cycle and the importance of that to human culture was really the foundation of mathematics, of art, of astronomy, of religion and symbolism and culture. So he wrote this in a letter in 1967 when he was super excited about his research. So in another letter, he wrote that, you know, this order of presentation is not random. So there was a system to it. And, you know, that there is advancing complexity in time. So this is showing the development of this menstrual-based culture. And he said that he had looked at over 1,000 artifacts. And that he found this lunar pattern was always present. So that means everything he looked at that was a type of artifact like this, it was a lunar calendar. So, you know, everybody was doing this. This was something that was happening in all kinds of locations within this kind of time in human history. People were making these tallies and counting in these 29-day cycles. So the other thing that he said about these symbols and these tallies, I'm just going to go back so that you can take another look at these. So that's the one from France. And these are the other two. So he was saying that some of them weren't to do with what was going on in the sky. So he believed that he called these story periods. He believed that these were ceremonial times. So people were counting these times of particular significance. So he believes that these were related to potentially like totem animals or times of feasting and harvest and ceremony. So he said that, you know, there was a difference between people who were counting and observing, or between these notations where people were counting and observing what was happening in the sky. And then there's a different type of notation, which is referring to these more cultural activities. So that these periods of time were, they were making reference to what may have been fasting or feasting days. They might have been days that were particularly auspicious for planting or for harvesting food. They might have been related to particular initiation rites within the culture. So he said that these points, these ceremonial times, always happened in the right season at some point within the lunar solar cycle, so that they were clearly related to lunar solar observations. So here's some more examples. So there's loads of these things, you know, ranging from, you know, as we said before, kind of 43,000 years to, you know, 8,000 years. So this is from quite an interesting blog. This guy, I've listed it on the resources, but he has found loads of examples of this kind of proto-writing. So this guy, Damien Marie, believes that, you know, the origins of writing came from these lunar tallies, these astronomical calendars, which is another interesting way of thinking about the alphabet and the development of language, that all of that was actually coming from people that were charting their moon cycle. So yeah, Marshak wrote to Scientific American, and he said that he believed these calendars were showing, you know, between a sort of 9 and a 13-month lunar calendar, so that people were using these moon cycles as a way of charting the seasons and the year. So something's just come up there. It's okay. Yeah, he said that they're not based on numbers, that they're based on ways of experiencing the seasons and the moons, which is a different way of looking at lunar calendars. And that, you know, in India, they still follow this lunar calendar form. And also the lunar calendar is very important in the Jewish religious year. So there are still lunar calendars that are in use. But he was saying that these notations, they were indicating that people were, you know, their idea of how long a year was quite fluid, and it was based on the way that they were experiencing those lunar changes within themselves and within the world around them. So therefore, that's why a lunar year could be anything between 9 to 13 months. So yeah, so an astronomer would say that these lunar calendars were expressing the observation of cosmological sequence as opposed to counting days. Does that make sense? Okay, stop me if you have any questions or anything you want to say about this, because I just think it's awesome. So here's some more. Go on.
Sorry, yeah. It was so as far as I can understand it, the idea of the bones is that people were recording the number of moons on the bones.
Right.
Is that right? And then it was their way of categorizing the seasons and the years. Is that
yeah, so some of these bones have been found in groupings, and so like tied together, or like they had holes in them, so it was like they would be affixed onto somebody's belt, maybe, or maybe they were hung up in a house. So some of them were found individually. So, you know, so I think some women probably had their own lunar calendar. you know, that was given to them maybe as a rite of initiation. So I'm guessing here, this is conjecture, but that these girls were initiated at the beginning of their moon time and their menarche, and maybe they were presented with a bone, and then they would, you know, mark that bone with the procession of the days in their own unique lunar calendar. And then there were some bones, and there was some also cave art, which had markings over a much longer period of time. And there were also, you know, bones which were found, as I say, in these kind of collections of bones, which makes me think that they were like a yearly calendar. So I think some of these calendars are indicating, so there's different reasons why you'd want to mark the lunar calendar. So in the for example, Chris Knight was an anthropologist who talked about the evolution of human culture through menstruation, and he was talking about hunting. So he was talking about particular times when it was easier to hunt because the herding animals, for example, they had a lot of young foals, or it was a time of year when the older, sicker animals would fall behind because there was a herd migration. So that was the better time to hunt. So that would happen at the time of a particular moon in the year, yeah? Or there's particular, so we're going to talk about this later in the presentation, but there are particular times when it's better to chop wood. It's better to harvest particular types of roots because they're less toxic and more edible. So there were lots of reasons to chart the moon cycle, but that people's awareness of the moon cycle came from the menstruating women. So, and this is why the women were the keepers of the calendars, you know, and it's like, even today, you know, we're the people that remember everybody's birthday, right, in our family. So I think this is still how it is that women are the keepers of time, and they're the keepers of stories in their families, you know. But I think this is so interesting, the fact that there are all of these lunar calendars and that they found them in places all over the world, you know. It's like it wasn't news to them. Everybody, every human on the planet knew about the moon cycle, and they knew about this correlation with the menstrual cycle, you know, in my understanding.
So Bliss, can I share this with you?
Yeah.
I have this brass ring, which I bought from an antique stall years ago. They didn't know what it was. They told me it was an African piece of jewelry of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I had it for years, and I kept feeling like it was a really special thing. And then I noticed after a few years of having it that it has very rudimentary marks in it, in groups of 9 or 10 dots. And anyway, it turns out, according to when I studied with Chris Knight, that's exactly what this is. So this is an African woman's charting of her menstrual cycle and her animals' menstrual cycles too, so that they could work out when each animal was going to birth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's so important, isn't it, to have this awareness if you are living in a culture where you're hunting and gathering, you know. You need to know what's happening for all the other animals as well as yourself, you know. And the estrus is different, apart from the rhesus macaque, you know. All the other kind of animals have a different cycle. So you studied with him. I want to know all about this.
Well, I just did a very short weekend course with him, and he wasn't teaching as such, but he sat in on the lectures because he's retired now.
Right.
But his, I don't know what you call her, but her name's Camilla Knight, not Camilla Knight, Camilla Power.
Okay.
And she's a professor under Professor Chris Knight. And she was leading the lectures that weekend on exactly what you were just talking about. But she specifically studied East African tribes people who are living exactly how our ancestors would have done. And she studied them to find out how they were living now, so that we could look back then on how we would have evolved. So why we respond to the moon cycles still, based on how they are still living. And a good chunk of it was exactly the stuff you were just talking about. And she was talking a lot about her study had found that the full moon, for example, meant that everybody was out hunting. No, sorry, dark moon, everyone was out hunting because more animals were out. And that was also correlated to when the women were bleeding. So the men would choose to go out hunting. There were more animals out hunting because the animals had better eyesight than us.
Right.
So it was super dangerous to go out hunting, but there were more animals out. So they'd go hunting during the dark moon, but it also correlated with the women bleeding. So the women would have power and control over the camp while the men were away. So it's sort of perfect balance of allowing the women their space, and also allowing the women to be in power. And then as the moon shifted and the men came back, they'd basically feast on whatever they had hunted during around the full moon time, and which also correlated with when the women were ovulating. Right. So the women, the hormone levels are more accommodating and loving and celebratory, as was the hunting. You know, they come back and they're all celebrating their hunt. So yeah,
I love it. Yeah, and wouldn't it be great, you know, if we could all send our families out somewhere for a week
wouldn't it?
Around that time? Yeah, it just makes so much sense.
I'll see if I can share on the group the stuff from Camilla Power and Chris Knight from that weekend.
Yeah, I would love to see that, because, you know, I just found someone who is summarizing his work. And Judy Grant talks about him a lot in her writing. But yeah, I think it would be really wonderful to have some of the original papers that he's put, because he's a really big name.
So
yeah,
cool
and she sounds like she's really carrying on his work.
Yeah,
which is fantastic, because these theories just keep developing over time, and I think we learn more and more, don't we, as we grow. So I really like this one at the bottom, because it's got these, maybe they're deer hooves, you know, and maybe they're vulvas, right? So maybe someone's kind of drawn some yonis, you know, and yeah, so there is this similarity between the hooves of animals, their footprints, and the shape of the vulva. So that's another thing to consider, is that, you know, women, they had this power where they were releasing their blood from this hoof-shaped, the camel toe, right? It's called the camel toe, right? So they're bleeding from their camel toe. And that is like telling you that that's when you can go and find the meat, you know, which is, it's like this natural chemical message that now is blood time. You know, so I think that's all fascinating, and I got really into finding these things, which leads me on to the next thing. Yeah, so the next thing was this kind of symbolism. So this is from Blood, Bread and Roses, which, you know, this book, you can read the whole book for free online. She's so generous, she's put a whole book there. So some of the bones that Marshak studied were eagle bones. So they were hollow bones of the eagle, and some of them were carved into flutes. So I've got a bone flute, which is actually carved from a deer bone. But yeah, so they were using these whistles, and they were also grooving them, so they were musical instruments as well as being tally markers, and they may have also been straws, so they may have also been using the blood. They may have been using it to make potions. They might have been mixing it with other substances. They might have been using it to make paint. So it's interesting that these were also sort of useful objects as well as being markers. So the eagle shows the shape of a white moon on its tail when it's flying. And it's also a predator, so it's associated with blood. So one of these eagle wings had a 6-month lunar calendar on its sides. And you know, he used a microscope. He found these really tiny markings that were indicating the lunar phases, you know, and then he found these tally marks again, which are from a direct observation of the moon. Yeah, and also there have been these similar calendar markings on yoni stones, you know, and on stone discs as well. So it's not just on bones. They've been marking these things on other objects as well. So it was obviously a really important part of this Paleolithic culture, was this tallying of the moon cycle. So this is Judy Grahn, who I kind of fell in love with over the course of researching for this presentation. So she wrote this book, which I've included in the resources. So, you know, nothing is compulsory, but I would encourage you to have a look at this book as part of doing this course. So she, following on really and inspired by Chris Knight, she developed this whole thing called metaformic theory. So she believed that menstruation created the world of human civilization. So she described this as being a metaform, and metaformic consciousness empowers us to understand the importance of menstruation in creation of culture. And so there are people doing work with this in economics, anthropology, linguistics, and sociology. And she also has a journal called Metaformia. So other contributors are writing, that's also in the resource list. So she says that her theory, you know, it centers women. So it puts us at the center of our origin stories, and in all rituals, in religion, you know, in the everyday. And I think it's wonderful because women have essentially been written out of history and culture. And so, for example, like when we talk about the history of music, you always hear about male composers. When you talk about the history of medicine, you always hear about male doctors. When you talk about the history of politics, you always hear about male. So, but actually, really, all of this time, women have been at the center of everything at the beginning. So I think, you know, this metaformic awareness gives us that understanding that women were there, and really they were central in the understanding of everything and the evolution of ideas. So metaformic theory is also inclusive of men and their cultural contributions, but it's just putting things in perspective, really. So yeah, you know, that these things have happened synchronistically. They've happened, you know, as our understanding of ourselves and the natural world evolved, so culture evolved. And that, you know, this was done collectively by women. So it's empowering for us to have an understanding of this, and that we then become more assertive in our willingness to share our creations, because we know that we've always been the creators of culture, and we've always been the creators of science. We've always been the creators of understanding physiology. And I think, like, this is really hard for a lot of women, because especially if you've been educated academically, you just always hear the names of men. But when you really look at the foundations of these knowings, these are things that are coming from the menstrual cycle and from women menstruators. And, you know, Brooke Medicine Eagle would say that it was coming from the dreamers. She would say that it was coming from the women who were in their menstrual huts for 3 days during their bleeding time, and that they were consciously creating the ceremonies for the tribe, and that they were dreaming in what needed to happen next. What did the tribe need to do to survive and to best take care of the land and of each other? So, you know, it's exciting because it empowers our role within institutions. So bringing this knowledge into those places where women have been until now oppressed, we can now come into it with a fresh perspective, knowing that we're empowered by our ancient history, you know, and by our very bodies. So, you know, this relates to motherhood, it relates to our sexuality, it relates to our place in the economy, you know, within education, within committed relationships, you know, or marriage, within child welfare, within the you know, even the government, you know, even the system of government that we have came from a council of women. This is a fact, that democracy came from First Nations councils of elder women. So this is something I'm going to touch on in another presentation, you know, but all of this stuff is coming from women's wisdom and women's knowing, and the understanding that a women-centered culture is more sustainable, you know, the military, you know, and also environmental issues. So it touches on every aspect of life. So, you know, there's more moon counting in ancient history. So there was a Chinese lunar calendar. The Mayan calendar. The fact that, you know, all of the calculation of time in Latin, all of these etymological origins of these words was coming from the monthlies. The mensura is a measurement. Gaelic words for menstruation and calendar are the same. You know, the Sabbats, you know, of Latium were related to the name of Kali. So is the destroyer, you know, the time of a void at the new moon. So, you know, this is not new. Like, and people have always known that the calendar and the menstrual cycle were the same thing. So I think it's really interesting how you know, the Julian calendar, for whatever reason, has veered off of that knowing and that understanding, that tradition of natural cycles. And it's almost like we're inhabiting this kind of artificial time within the modern calendar and within the modern even the hours of day. So yeah, it's interesting to consider that. How would time be different? Yeah, go on.
It was just on that point that you were just talking about. So you said it's almost like we're inhabiting a time that's almost not, it's not real to the actual sort of existence of the planetary.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
So how would we experience time differently
yeah, and
if
I've,
we
you
were
know, that's
listening to our
something
bodies?
I've contemplated that a fair, not lots, but a fair amount since sort of discovering the Mayan calendar and the details with which the Mayan calendar goes into. For each day there is a description for something that's significant about that day, you know. And you look at the way our calendar is Monday to Sunday, the name repeats again and again, 52 weeks of the year, 12 months, and the cycle then repeats again. In the Mayan calendar, there's no repetition. Each day has a different name.
Yeah.
It's there isn't this almost sense of monotony that our calendar seems to give us. That it's from my perspective anyway, it seems to lack a depth and an essence of like that sort of active connection with the times that are changing and the times that are continuing to that we're continuing to embody a changing living existence and time. We're not embodying something that is a repetitive or a repeat of last week or the week. Each day is different, and each,
Yeah.
and I really feel quite, yeah, like really strongly what you said is very true, that that there is that aspect of a lack of recognition of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's confusing. And
Yeah.
I think, you know, it's a disembodied
Yes.
system. It's a conceptual system of
Very
counting.
much. Yeah.
But it's not taking into account what we're actually experiencing, because our perception of time varies according to our emotions,
Yeah.
you know, and what we're experiencing externally. So I'm going to talk more about this later in
Yeah.
the
Great.
presentation, but I think it's so interesting to think about how would time be different if we had perceived that connection between what we're experiencing in our bodies and the cycles of nature and the cycles of the you know, the cosmic bodies that were around the earth. So I just think that's really interesting. Like, how would the world be different, you know, if we hadn't been using this artificial construct of the Julian calendar and we continued working with the lunar
Yeah.
calendar and the lunar years? So
I think
go on.
one thing that would be massively different would be people's sense of purpose in their in space, in their lives. That sense of actual connection, like you just said, disembodied. There's so much disembodiment through, because it's such a conceptual calendar.
Yeah, and stuff like seasonal affective disorder, you know,
Yeah.
I'm interested in how that's labeled as being a disorder when it's actually more like having an awareness of the changing season and
Yeah.
a need to be not you know, like productive economically. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
I'm sad
Yeah.
because I still have to get up and go to work when it's cold and
Yeah.
dark. And you know, I want to sit by the fire.
Absolutely.
You know, so
Yeah.
it's like we've pathologized
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
is actually an awareness and a sensitivity of the cycles of the seasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so it's actually affecting the length of the days. So it increases the length of the day by 2.3 milliseconds. So it's not a lot, you know, but it's enough to be noticeable every century. So Yeah, it's our closest neighbour, and it's around about 236,000 miles away. So it's a quarter of the size in its diameter, and the same face of the moon is always pointed towards the Earth. So it's like somebody that is kind of walking around, but they don't want to stop talking to you, so they're always looking at you. So it was formed 4.5 billion years ago, and it's not long after the Earth was formed. So the most widely touted explanation is that there was an impact between another planetary body called Theia, and that this impacted the Earth, and then part of it burst out, and those fragments are what formed the moon. So this is my cool graphic. Yeah, so this is how, that's the sun in the middle. And then that's the moon there, that little one that you can see. And that's the Earth. So this is how these bodies are moving in the sky, as far as we know. So there's 8 sort of typical lunar phases that people talk about in astronomy. And most people only talk about the 4 principal phases, which are the new moon, first quarter moon, full moon, and the third quarter. So, yeah, first of all, the right-hand side of the moon becomes illuminated. So this is the waxing crescent moon. And then if the left-hand side of the moon is illuminated, then that's when the moon is waning. So it's a waning crescent. That's when it's getting smaller. So in the south, you would see it the other way. So if you're in Australia, then the moon is waxing on the left-hand side and waning on the right-hand side. So this is what it looks like in a flat graphic. So when the moon is new, that's because it's on the sun side. So you can't see it at night because we're turned away from the sun. So yeah, when the moon is full, yeah, okay, so does that kind of make a bit of sense? So it's far from the sun. So we can see lots of sunlight. So moonlight is actually reflected sunlight. So I know you all know this, but we're just going over it to get this deep understanding of it, okay? So I'm sorry if it seems like you're 5 and I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but I still think it's really cool. So different names of different types of moons. So the blood moon is the type of full moon that you get during a lunar eclipse, because the sunlight that would normally make the moon white is refracted around the hemisphere of Earth. So we're like a red filter. So our planet is creating a red filter for the sunshine, which creates the blood moon. So our atmosphere scatters the blue wavelength and only allows the red waves to reflect. So does that make sense? Stop me if you know. So here's some other
like, it's like how like the light is diffracted is called, yeah?
Yeah,
like,
so it splits the waveform of the light.
Yeah. So it's like the red waveform is the only one that passes towards the moon then, and the others just like reflected to the cosmos. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so they get sort of diffracted by the atmosphere. They get kind of absorbed, I think, is actually what happens. And the red wave can travel much further, I think. And I don't, does anybody else know about physics in this group?
I think a little bit that has to do maybe like how like if you take I'm not really sure about what I'm saying, okay, like, but how the light is coming, yeah, like the way that it comes towards the earth, you know,
Yeah.
like how it's like how you have the rainbow in a way, yeah, it's like
Yeah.
with the same way it's like refracted. So like
Yeah.
because it passes from the earth, the red is the only one that manages to reach.
Yeah, because
the
it's
other
much
rays
longer.
are, you understand
Yeah.
what I mean? Because the others just refracted to this. I'm sorry for my English as well.
No,
I'm
it's
sorry. So I
fine.
hope
It's
you
good.
understand, yeah, what I try to say.
It's yeah, I think it's really interesting that the red travels, you know, it can kind of get through even when all of those other waveforms have been dissipated or you know, reflected back. Somehow the red finds its way around. So blood moons are obviously interesting astrologically. So it can be quite challenging when there's a blood moon. You know, there's things happening. It's like sudden change, isn't it, and transformation. So yeah, I think it's a sign of something meaningful. Yeah. So the supermoon, this is when the moon, it appears bigger than it really is because it's closer to the earth. So astronomers call this a perigean full moon, and it's basically because it's the closest point of its orbit, and it's also coincided with a full moon. So that's what a supermoon is. So they just look big because they're closer. So a blue moon is not really blue. It's still a white moon. It's just the second moon if there's in a calendar month. So this is to do with the Julian calendar, and this is where we get a bit, you know, like this calendar is not real, because there's 2 moons in 1 month. So yeah, because it doesn't happen very often, only 2.5 years. They say once in a blue moon means like rarely. So that's like an English phrase. I don't know if you have that expression in other countries. But yeah, so once in a blue moon is like, oh, well, it probably won't happen. But it does happen like every 2.5 years. So that's what a blue moon is. So the harvest moon is a sort of seasonal name for the moon. And this is the moon that occurs closest to the start of autumn. And it's said that the farmers, you know, would be out harvesting the crops in the moonlight. So that's why it's called the harvest moon, because it's giving you more light for the harvest. And again, a black moon, you know, is like a second new moon in a calendar month. So it's black because you can't see it. And they happen every 2.5 to sort of 2.7 years. So again, you know, once in a black moon is even less chance than once in a blue moon of, you know, catching a bus, for example. So yeah, the wolf moon, this is called the wolf moon because it's in January, and you know, the wolves would come and howl outside the village because they were hungry in the dead of winter. So this is why it's called a wolf moon. So you have to be, you know, careful if you're walking out alone at night. And the crow moon is the moon that happens in March. So the March full moon is when the crows return during the spring thaw. And in the UK, this is known as the worm moon because the frost has broken. So the worms come up above the ground, and the birds that have returned from winter migrations feast on the worm. So sometimes the crow moon is known as the worm moon. So there's lots of names for different moons. So, you know, the egg moon, pink moon, milk moon, sturgeon moon. So they've all got different names which are relating to different seasons or different animals. Yeah, the moon, the moon's gravitational pull causes something called precession, which is a change in the angle of the Earth's tilt, which happens, you know, and on a 21,000-year cycle. So this does affect the precession of the seasons in a small way. So if we didn't have a moon, then that cycle would be longer, but it would also be larger, so the Earth would wobble more, it would tilt more. So with the moon, it kind of tilts, but only a little bit. But if we didn't have a moon, it would probably be more like but it would just take a much longer time, but we'd kind of wobble about more. So have you ever had like a spinning top? So it's kind of that kind of idea. So the seasons on Earth would be more extreme, and those changes would happen over a longer cycle if we didn't have a moon. But yes, so the moon doesn't affect the seasons, but the moon doesn't affect the seasons in a way that we can perceive. But the names of seasonal moons are related to things that happen at that time of year around those moons, but the moon's not really controlling them. Does that make sense? Cool. So here's some more names of moons. The frosty moon I like. Yeah, and the beaver moon, because that was a good time for catching beavers. So there's lots of different names for moons. The hot moon in June. And the windy moon in March. So yeah, that's just a bit of fun really. So you can name your own moon depending on what's happening for you in your life. So I'm going to call this, you know, the plum moon, because we still haven't eaten all those plums. That's what's happening for me with my moon. So anyway, while I was doing all this research, I decided to include this extra section in the presentation that I didn't talk about in the course plan, because I'm so interested in plants and herbs. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a gardener. So I love the fact that people around the world have been changing their growing and harvesting practice, and that these things are also related to the moon. So this is like a bonus section, part of the presentation. Right. So in ancient history, Pliny the Elder, he said that Roman farmers should pick their fruit at the full moon for market because it would weigh more, and to pick at the new moon for personal consumption, as that moon oh, somebody said something in the chat. Oh, I'm a good, we got more gardeners, that's great. Yeah, so yeah, your fruit would keep better if you picked it at the new moon. And he also said that you should chop lumber at the new moon. And then in France, they have this saying, which is softwood when waxing, hardwood when waning. So this is an ancient rule that says firewood should be cut at the opposite lunar phase as construction would. So that's really interesting. And whenever plant materials were required to be strong and resistant to the environment, they're often harvested during a waning moon. This is in France. Medicines are often harvested during the new moon following a waxing period. So that might be useful to know. I mean, I just tend to go out into my garden when I feel like it. But what I'm starting to realize is that I have more energy to go out into my garden when the moon is waxing and when it's full. And then I have less energy to go out into my garden when it's kind of waning and new. So I don't really pay attention to this stuff. But I did have a biodynamic calendar one year that was telling me when to plant. And it was kind of along those lines. But like for my herbal teas, I just tend to go out and pick the herbs. So I'm wondering if it might be better to actually harvest the herbs and then dry them out, if it'd be more powerful at certain times of the moon, according to this. So it's just, I just found it really interesting. So I thought I'd chuck it in.
Yeah, can I say something? Like in Greece,
Yeah.
like all mothers and grandmothers, like they still keep on planting and like, of course, like doing a lot of the traditional works according to the moon. Like, for example, like when you want to cut your roses, when like everything happens like according to the moon, it's like, because like when is the full moon, it just like drags all the waters up. Is that does the same to us as it does to the plants? Yeah, as it does to our hair. In Greece, we cut our hair in the full moon so they can grow faster because like all the energy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like there's a big tradition. They still keep on doing things, like most of them unconsciously now, but they still keep the tradition, and the same with the gardening. That's why like you have to cut the herbs, like when it's for personal use, you cut it when the moon is waxing because it's going to be more nutritious and potent. But when it's the full moon, it's going to be full of water. So in reality, they're getting bigger and they look heavier, but in reality, they're just full of water in a way.
It's great. I love it. You know, it's so interesting. So yeah. Hang on, lost my thing. Right. So as you were saying, the Mayans also believed that the moon controlled sap flow in plants, and that nighttime brought the healing properties of the plants down into the roots, down below the earth. So in other South American countries, they would harvest things during the full moon because they were more resistant to insects. So particularly like house thatch from the article that I was reading. So I've included this article in the resources in the unit. It was amazing. It was from like the Botanical Herbal Association of America, and it was so detailed. It had loads of links to different research papers, you know, ethnobotany studies. So I think it's really fascinating. So the descendants of the Inca, the Quechua, they make their plows and they only harvest those trees during the first waning moon after the start of spring. So they'll make their plows out of that wood that's harvested during that moon. And in Micronesia, the Kosrae elders have suggested that their roof thatch should only be harvested after the full moon. And then when the moon is gone, I guess they stop harvesting it. So that brings us to the work of Gunter Klein, who has passed away. And I couldn't find a photo that I was sure was him, because there's about 50 people on the internet that are called Gunter Klein. So I didn't want to get the wrong one. So instead, I've got a picture of his book. And unfortunately, Gunter Klein passed away while he was still compiling the research data to support his theory of chronobiology. So his work was unfinished. And I think there are other researchers who have taken up the mantle, but he was really the initiator of this new discipline of chronobiology. So Gunter Klein, he asserted that our biological rhythms are controlled by external forces. So we've all got this biological clock which runs over 24 hours, relating to the rotation of the earth. So some people call it the central oscillator and it imposes these rhythms on our physiological, biochemical and molecular events. So this is also expressed in Chinese medicine. You know how you have like an hour for every organ in your body? So yeah, plants also have this mechanism, but we know that for plants, it's externally modified. So, for example, if you grow plants under lights, you can change their biorhythm by the times that you turn the lights on and off, yeah? So, Gunter said that this is also the case for humans. So, yeah, his studies were on beans growing. So he was looking at how these beans grew in relation to the tidal flows. And so another scientist called Barlow supported Klein's work. So he repeated the study, and he showed that these beans, you know, were growing in relation to the tides. So these plants, these effects, so these, like, you know, cultural things that people are saying about plants and the moon have been supported by the science here of chronobiology. So you know, there's more stuff here about trees. So yeah, the seeds germinated at different rates depending on if it was the full moon or the new moon. And there's also this physicist who looked at the effects of gravity from the moon on the water within living cells. And he found a pattern, he found a rhythmic pulse, a rhythmic pattern within the water of living cells. And this pattern showed the greatest amount of change during the new moon. So that's fascinating, the quantum Hall effect. Yeah, so this stuff, you know, definitely happening. So then I've kind of gone a little bit fluffy here, but, you know, there's this understanding that we have these lunar correspondences within the brain, and particularly within the pituitary gland. So I have posted a study to support this, but the study was done on mice, and it's in the resources in the unit. So particularly the pituitary is like a gravitational lunar sensor, according to this study. So in this kind of medical astrology, the moon is associated with the digestive system. It's also associated with the uterus, the ovaries, the breasts, and the menstrual cycle, and also the lymphatic system and the nervous system, sympathetic nervous system. Mainly because the moon is associated with the element of water and the flow of water in our bodies. So we just looked at how the tides are affecting the water flow within each of our cells. So I think that holds water. So yeah, astrology and its use in medicine and in herbalism particularly. Kind of lost all of you. I shrunk your faces and now I can't get you back again. Oh, there you are. Hello, I can see you all again now. Yeah, so doctors in the past used the moon to track the progression of different illnesses, and so they would be monitoring how people were responding at different phases of the moon. It's interesting to have a moon journal for yourself, for your own health and for your own mental well-being. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the next session is we're going to be making some moon mandalas. And so, you know, this is something that then you could use that in the same way as you would a journal. So you can chart, you know, what's happening for you at different phases of your cycle. And over the course of time, you can see how, you know, are these things affecting you particularly at particular stages of the lunar cycle, you know, rather than looking at different days of the month, the Julian month. So yeah, it's interesting. Balance in Leo. So it's interesting to look at what this means, and I'd love for us to do a share between sessions, because you look up what your moon is in your natal chart, and then post a share about what that means in the group. If everybody's happy to do that, I think it would be interesting. I know that like where your moon sits in your astrology chart, it represents your kind of inner self, like your hidden self, the part of you that's secretly really you. So I mean, for me, like my moon's in Sag, and that kind of explains how I have the capacity to be really gregarious, despite the fact that I'm actually deeply introverted. But I sort of have this way of like pulling out the part of me that's a real butterfly, you know, a real extrovert. And my partner is a Sagittarius as well. So I don't know, there's some kind of affinity there. A lot of my really good friends are Sagittarians, so I think there is a part of me that feels really connected with that kind of loopy energy of Sag. Yeah, but I'm not an astrologer, so I only really know about my own chart, but I'm interested to learn more about your charts, and I love the fact that this is being used in healthcare and medicine. So having an awareness of how your physiological state is related to the lunar happenings may help you to discover more about your own cycle, your own hormones, your own emotions through the month. So the tides, yeah, the movement of the moon affects the tides of our blood. It's affecting our intuition. Herbs that are associated with the moon act on the waters of the body, and the action of fluids in the body is related to elimination, digestion, and gut feeling. So again, I have posted a link to herbs that are associated with the moon, so that's in the unit resources. Yeah, so the moon relates to intuition and emotion. It also relates to our vulnerabilities, so the things that we try to protect. Yeah, so this is another way that astrology can be used in terms of calculating your health. Not necessarily your health outcomes, but possibly tendencies towards particular types of ailments. They might come up in your birth chart. So if an astrologer has said to you, oh, you know, you might be prone to problems with your gut, it may be that that's because they've looked at the position of your moon in your natal chart. So yeah, it's just another perspective, and it's something that I don't know a lot about. I think it's worthy of consideration. It's worthy of looking at it more deeply, because this developed over, you know, many thousands of years. Really, these techniques were being used before modern medicine, and we think kind of all of this medicine that's being used now has only been around for about 100 years. It's quite weird to consider that, and then everything else has been thrown out the window. Yeah, so I really like this artwork, and I've shared it. I've shared the link that you can find the artist on DeviantArt. Yeah, so the moon affects the energy within our body, and this is felt emotionally because You know, we're electromagnetic vibrational beings, and water is a conduit for that energy. So if it's moving in our bodies, it's affecting the way the flow of the electricity within our bodies is moving. So yeah, our emotions are expressed in this changing, transforming way, and this influences our womb cycle and also the cycles of blood moving through our heart. So the moon governs the heart space and the emotional body, and the female body is cycling with the moon, which determines fertility and creativity, inspiration, and letting go. So I'm sure all of you know this, but it's good to just say it again. So in my view, electric light has disconnected us from our natural lunar cycles. Yeah, we don't see and connect with the moon as often as we would if we didn't have electric light, and our biorhythms have been affected by artificial light. So for example, using a laptop in the evening or using your phone in bed, you know, all of this is affecting your natural biorhythm. So this leads me on to the next thing. Yeah, so we were in this kind of communion in ancient times with the moon, and the moon governed the rituals relating to fertility as well as health and well-being. So dreaming is nurtured by the moon, our intuition. And if we become disconnected from the moon, we become less aware of our inner knowing. We'll become disconnected from that dreaming. So this then leads to disconnection in other things. So disconnection from our sexuality, you know, our general health, you know, and disconnection from our emotional selves as well. So I'm just showing a picture of the brain because the pineal gland is affected by light. And this gland, you know, it has an influence on the rest of our endocrine system, on the rest of our endocrine functioning, and therefore on our emotions as well as on our hormones. Does anyone have anything they want to say about this? Do you have a comment or a contribution? Okay, so just something to think about. So the menstrual cycle globally averages out about 29 days, and the lunar cycle lasts 29.5 days. But the menstrual cycle for women can vary between 24 days and 38 days. So about half of the population will start their period either around the full moon or around the new moon. So your menstrual cycle, the length of your cycle can vary depending on your age and also your ethnicity. So yeah, it's not even spread out over everyone in the world. So this is information that's come from the period tracker app Clue. So they have looked at the cycles of 7.5 million people, and I've included this in the resources because they've done a massive meta-analysis with someone who's like an astrophysicist who's been looking at the data. Yeah, so that's great. So Becky's using Clue. Yeah, it's worth looking into. I haven't used it, but I've read a lot of the articles and the data. They talk a lot about Chris Knight as well. So I've shared a couple of articles from them in the resources. So yeah, so this is from their meta-analysis. So they've looked at lots of different studies relating to menstruation, and I've shared as many of these as I can in the resources, so you can read the actual papers as well as reading this summary. So yeah, 3 of those studies found that women tend to menstruate between the first and last quarter of the lunar cycle. But then the other people would just start their period randomly at any time of the month. So one of these studies found that teenagers were more likely to menstruate around the first and third lunar quarters, regardless of the length of their cycle. One of these studies found that people were more likely to menstruate during the new moon. 3 studies found no association between the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle. So this is Dr. Cutler, and I just decided to put her in a little heart and feature her because they didn't mention her name in the whole meta-analysis on Clue. They just said one author, and and I looked her up because she's a human being, and yeah, she's kind of a trailblazer actually. So she found that there was a correlation, but her studies were done in 1980, and 86. So this is kind of before people had mobile phones. So I don't know, is the influence of the artificial light changing people's physiological cycle? And then, you know, so the data which is now being gathered on this app is so different to what Dr. Cutler found, yeah, back in the 80s. So yeah, Dr. Cutler found that 69% of her participants had their periods between the first quarter and the last quarter, so the light half of the moon cycle. So this was people were menstruating around the full moon. So yeah, she decided that there was an association between the lunar phase and the menstrual cycle. They found in her first study, people with irregular cycles were like more people who had an irregular cycle were more likely to menstruate during the light half of the moon, and people that had regular cycles menstruated more during the dark half of the moon. So, you know, this is interesting to consider. 64 of these participants that had an irregular cycle, they came on during the light half of the moon. And 46 had their cycle during the dark half. So yeah, I know there's a lot of kind of boring research stuff here, but just bear with me if this isn't your thing. So there's another study in 87. So they looked at data from samples between 1976 and 1983. And they only used people that had a cycle length of 29.5 days. So they used the data to make graphs, and they plotted people's moon cycle on the x-axis, the day of the cycle, and on the y-axis, they plotted percentage of people who started menstruating during that day. So they said if it wasn't a flat line, then this suggested a relationship to the moon cycle. So only half of the findings of this study were statistically significant, and the other half were not. So it could have been completely random. And even in the days that were statistically significant, the difference was very small. So it was only 2% who menstruated on the new moon, and only 4.5% menstruated after the full moon. So there's some more studies. So a study from 90, so you can look at all of these in the research section of the unit. So I've just listed them. It says paper, and then it's got the name of the author. So if you want to read this scientific research, you can. So in a study from 1981, they found that people were more likely to menstruate during the night half of the lunar cycle. 1 in 3 people had cycle lengths of 29.5 days. So what they're showing is that people are ovulating at random points during the cycle. And they don't necessarily show that people's cycle is synchronous with the moon. So there's some more studies. So I haven't included every single one of these in the resources, but I have included the most exciting, relevant ones. So yeah, people that work night shifts are more likely to have irregular cycles. And also people's hormones are affected by changes in the seasons. So, I mean, that's another thing to consider in terms of the regulatory cycle of menstruation. So, this is a picture of the 10 lunar phases that are often used to describe the cycle of menstruation. So we can connect with these in our own personal practices. Does anyone have any questions or comments relating to all of that research stuff? Okay. So, yeah, these are some kind of symbologies or different associations that we can make with the different phases of the moon. So, Ruth, I know you know all about this stuff as well. Please feel free to chip in if you've got anything to say. So the new moon takes place over 3 days, and it consists of the dark moon, which represents death. It's the day before the new moon itself, which represents conception, and the crescent moon, which is representing rebirth, day after the new moon. So the waxing crescent moon is new beginnings. It's like the child time of the cycle. It's time to vision your month. The crescent moon is playful, and it's a great time to honor your maiden, your inner child self. So the waxing first quarter is a place of nurturance and balance. It's the time to heal and replenish. This first quarter moon is representing the virgin phase, your sovereignty, your independence, your nurturing, and it's good for self-love. As you express your authentic self. So the waxing gibbous moon is a time of creativity and flow. It's a heartful celebration. It's a sexual moon. You know, you can celebrate pleasure. It's a lover moon of union. The full moon is a time of ritual and gratitude. So, yeah. It's celebrating home, family, and belonging. It can reveal shadows. Things are brought to light. It clarifies and helps us to shed what no longer serves us. It's a celebration of the union of the maternal and paternal energies. So the waning moon represents spiritual awakening, our sacred practice, and our personal practice. It's about maturing and connecting within the self. It's a phase of manifestation and celebration of the divine essence. Yeah, and giving us freedom, cutting away what doesn't serve us. So the last quarter waning moon honors our sovereignty. It's establishing our boundaries, celebrating a new balance within ourselves. really celebrating our magnificence, that we're alive. Yeah, it's a social moon, and it honors our empowered state of being, celebrates the sovereign, the empress, and the emperor. So the waning balsamic moon is the final quarter, and it's the time for us really to go within. It's a time for reviewing, reflecting, resting, and clearing out. So this is really where we go into the underworld, and it's honoring the elder, the wisdom keeper, and the teacher. And the dark moon is the death phase of the cycle, a time of letting go. So it's the big spirit, the dreaming self, and honoring of the ancestors, supporting the ancestors and the bone mothers as we merge with the cosmic self. So yeah, according to Chris Knight, you know, we're the only species really that has this menstrual cycle. So we share our cycle length with the rhesus macaque. Is it macaque or macaque? I don't know. It's another primate. So yeah, they're close, but we share our cycle with the moon. So there's this understanding that that's what triggered conceptual thought, human evolution, is that we noticed that what was going on inside of our bodies was also happening externally in the movement of this cosmic body. And so we kind of these kind of hominids, these pre-human women, were secluding themselves at this time of the dark moon. And they must have observed that the light of the moon was also hiding while they were hiding. And they might have come to notice that the rising sun was the same color as their blood, the light returning. And they noticed that, you know, the difference between dark and light. Yeah, I love this idea of these emerging concepts in the minds of the pre-human women, you know, these ancestral menstruators, and this kind of knowing that they were creating light when they emerged from darkness. At the end of their bleed, the light would return, coming into the light. Yeah, and so I've just included some of these red ochre handprints that have been found in ancient Paleolithic caves around the world, because I've always believed that the markings in these caves were related to cosmological cycles and rites of initiation and blood rites. So you know, they were making their mark at this time when they entered into the cave. I think it was a place of initiation. So oh, here she is. Right. So the idea of dividing the sky or the moon into parts, and there's this thing about cutting a cake, celebrating with a cake, and the cake is representing the cycle of our lives, or the lunar cycle, the medicine wheel, and the idea of the medicine wheel coming from this cycle of transition within the sky and within our bodies. So again, it's coming back to the calendar, it's coming back to the movement of you know, how things are changing over the lunar month. So yeah, they still have ceremonies where they're cutting cakes in religious rites today, and these cuts, you know, are associated with the coordination of the sun and the moon. Yeah, the idea of quartering the sky and creating the direction. So that in Tibet, they've coordinated the moon phase with the directions. So east is the crescent moon, west is the full moon, south is the half moon, and north is the dark moon. And then I found this lunar medicine wheel that shows those things. Does anyone have a comment to make about this? Okay. So
I don't know. The only thing I can think to say is I heard that in France, when girls get their period, if they make a cake. I heard about this years ago, but I could just, if you decorated the top of the cake with that and the side of the cake, it would be a really pretty cake. Because if I have a daughter, I would like to do that for her. I want to bake a cake. I want to make a thing. And I don't know, I can just see a cake.
yeah, I think cake is always the answer. And you know, it's funny because my friend Glenn, who's like my spiritual dad, he came round today to get his trailer that I borrowed, and he brought me a cake. And you know, fuck me if this cake isn't red and white, you know, in layers. And I was looking at it and I was thinking that is the blood cake for the moon, and he didn't even know. And I was like, look at this PowerPoint I made, I'm doing this course, blah blah blah, you know, it's about my thing. And he bought this cake. So yeah, I think it is a symbolic initiatory ritual to share this kind of food. And it's still like the wedding cake, you know, is an example of how this is carried on into our culture. Yeah, so I think it's really relevant. And breaking bread as well. I think the bread is symbolizing the womb, you know, and how it's cooked in the oven, all of that stuff. So don't worry, we haven't got much more. See people rubbing their eyes. So here's another one. Here's another lunar medicine wheel, which again is talking about all these different concepts that I covered in the last few slides. So it's quite a good graphic talking about those different energies and those different associations with different phases of the lunar cycle. That just leads me to the final slide, which is about magic number 3. And so these 3 days of the menstruation of the hidden moon, yeah, this is a number associated with death and rebirth, with completion, with all things being equal. Yeah, the association of the moon's disappearance and reappearance. And so there's the lunar hair in the magician's hat. So he disappears and then he reappears. So I just thought that was a really lovely image to finish on. So yeah, we're just about good for time now. So